Paul Dodd. He's a scientist at Norwegian Polar Institute, Norway. He'll be talking about sustainable observations in the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. As people have said already, there is no environment on Earth which is changing as quickly as the Central Arctic Ocean. In the picture behind me, you can see the Norwegian ice-breaking research vessel in the Amundsen Basin during the last field season. And it's surrounded by sea ice, but also you can see here these dark patches of melt ponds on the surface of the ice, and also leads in the ice, which have a very different albedo. They look almost black compared to the sea ice. And it's this change in color as the sea ice is retreating, which is making the Arctic warm so much faster than the rest of the world, as others have mentioned already today. But these changes are not limited only to the Arctic. Before the break, Dr. Krishnan showed this global thermohaline overturning circulation, and this is very strongly influenced by fresh water from the Arctic, which is passing out of the Arctic Ocean itself and decreasing the rates of deep water formation in the North Atlantic, with widespread consequences for global climate. So I'd like to show you a map of the Arctic Ocean and talk about some features. The first thing you'll notice is that the ocean is almost completely surrounded by land, with only 3 real gateways connected to the rest of the global ocean. And this land, especially in the northern parts of Siberia, contains very large drainage basins. And this means that the Arctic Ocean receives huge amounts of fresh water relative to its reasonably small size. Now, since measurements began in the 1950s, precipitation has only increased by about 5%, which is not that significant because there's a lot of interannual variability. But the last period has been very wet, with the 5 wettest years on record being since the 2000s. So we can expect that the Arctic Ocean will receive more fresh water in the future. This freshwater input, it drives surface circulation, which I've shown with the dark blue arrows on this map here. And that consists of the Beaufort Gyre, this circular formation, and the transpolar drift, which is a major current bringing fresh water across the Arctic Ocean. These 2 features are extremely sensitive to the atmospheric forcing, which can vary on scales of 5 to 10 years. And when that happens, with a favorable atmospheric circulation, the Beaufort Gyre can grow much larger, and with an unfavorable circulation, the opposite. We know from observations that a lot of fresh water has been accumulating in this Beaufort Gyre. But the question we need to answer now is, when will that fresh water be released, and how will it be released? About 50% of the fresh water flowing out of the Arctic comes through Fram Strait, and about 50% through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. We know that in the past there's been so-called great salinity anomalies, when very fresh events passed out through these gateways and slowed down the deep water formation and global overturning circulation. But those events were essentially an advected signal. They were not produced in the Arctic. However, we can see that a release of fresh water originating in the Arctic could affect the world through a similar mechanism. So far, I've only talked about liquid fresh water, but sea ice is also a very important way in which fresh water is exported from the Arctic. In Fram Strait, you can see there are some yellow stars there, which represent an observatory that the Polar Institute has maintained for more than 30 years there. And this has been measuring the thickness and volume of ice exported from the Arctic Ocean. Recently, scientists from the Institute have published a new paper in the journal Nature describing the reasons for the changes that we've observed so far. So I can say very briefly that there's been a shift from very thick and deformed sea ice to thinner and more even first-year ice. And one of the reasons for that is the change in the speed of sea ice in the Central Arctic Ocean. We can see from satellite products that the ice is moving much more quickly now. To form really thick ice, thicker than about 2 meters, you can't do this thermodynamically. When the ice is about 2 meters thick, it insulates the ocean underneath so well it doesn't grow much thicker. To get beyond this thickness, you need dynamic processes rafting the ice together. And this takes a lot of time. If the ice is not spending so much time in the Arctic Ocean, it doesn't have time to experience this much deformation. The red arrows on the map show the inflow of warm Atlantic water. These currents have enough heat to quickly melt away all of the remaining sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. But that doesn't happen because this water is subducted beneath the fresh, low-density polar layer. We know that the temperature, at least of the Atlantic inflowing water, and the volume is increasing with time. So we can ask the question, how much can this increase before it's removing all the ice, at least in summer? That's a question that we might like to ask to coupled climate models. A recent study at the Institute has investigated how reliable the predictions from these kind of models are. And they compared 14 of some of the most popular models, including those used by the IPCC, with the best complete data set that we could assemble from observations. And the findings were that the predictions of those models are likely too conservative. In the observations, we see that the warming or the warm water has increased in temperature more than the models predict, and also that that water is found closer to the ice than those models predicted. So if we really want to understand what's happening in the Arctic, I think we need to establish a system of sustained observations. A lot of our existing knowledge comes from measurements at these three gateways around the edges of the Arctic. But as the ice retreats and more powerful and advanced research vessels are available to many nations, we can start to do this kind of monitoring directly inside the Central Arctic Ocean. And NPI has taken some steps to contribute to this initiative by establishing 2 moorings last season. And those 2 stars you see in the Amundsen and Nansen basins were put out last year. And I have some slides now showing a little bit what's on those moorings. So at the top of the moorings, there are upward-looking sonar, ice profiling sonar, which are measuring the ice thickness by sending, it's like an upside-down echo sounder. It's sending a ping there. And beneath these, there are also acoustic current meters, which are measuring the currents there and also give us the ice motion. A little further down on these moorings, we have ultraviolet nitrate analyzers, which are telling us how much nitrate is available to the ecosystem in this area where light is also available. Beneath these, we have water samplers, which are collecting 48 samples of water year-round at times when the ice conditions are too difficult for us to be there with the ship. And these are primarily for environmental DNA analysis, because it's very difficult to categorize the ecosystem when you can't be there year-round. Also, in relation to the ecosystem, we have acoustic recorders, which are measuring the presence of vocalizing marine mammals. These can be narwhals and also bowhead whales that we think live in the ice. Another thing we can do with these is to measure the background soundscape in the Arctic Ocean before there's increasing human activities and more shipping and so on. At the bottom of these moorings, we have sediment traps. This is to see a little bit how much carbon is being fixed by the ecosystem and sequestrated into the sediments. But also the material collected by these can be used for more environmental DNA analyses. These moorings are, of course, just point measurements, and we'd like a little broader context to know what's going on in the Arctic Ocean. On the map here, you can see the route of the ship during the expedition last summer, leaving from Longyearbyen, heading first towards the North Pole, exploiting a reasonably reliable corridor of relatively easier ice, and then moving through heavier ice towards the northern tip of Greenland and starting this section. The ship stopped every 10 nautical miles to measure the instrument package you can see on the bottom picture down to the bottom of the ocean, measuring a complete section of temperature and salinity and dissolved oxygen concentrations. But this is also equipped with 24 bottles which can collect water samples to measure parameters which are too advanced to measure in situ by underwater instrumentation. And one example of that would be metabarcoding for genomics, and 2 partners from NC4 came on that expedition to take water samples to do these analyses after the cruise, and that was a very nice addition. It tells us a little bit about how bacteria play a role in nutrient cycling in the Central Arctic. These images just show some very initial results along that section. At the bottom you can see the deep Nansen and Amundsen basins. In the temperature section, you can see this very warm water which is entering primarily into the Nansen Basin. And on the other side, you see the salinity, which is very fresh in the Amundsen Basin. This is actually the fresh transpolar drift that we see there. I'll just point out one feature, which is if you look at this warm layer in the middle of the plot there, this is the warm Atlantic water entering the ocean. And such a dense survey enables us to see these eddy-like features reaching quite far, almost to the Gackel Ridge in the middle, suggesting these might be important for the transfer of heat vertically in the water column. The ship also stopped to do some measurements on the sea ice. These are for biological and physical properties of sea ice, ice thickness, but also to measure the turbulence right underneath the ice at a small scale. If we think about heat melting sea ice, those last few meters are also very important, and so we collected a lot of measurements in that layer. In terms of outlook, we will have another cruise this year at the beginning of June. This will just repeat the southern part of the translect I showed in the previous map. The ice conditions are a lot tougher at that time of year, so we won't be able to get so far. But the biology is much more active now because it's closer to the spring bloom. So this is really focusing on those procedures. And then next year in 2024, we will try to get back those moorings that I showed the pictures of. And if that goes successfully, we'll have a 2-year time series of a very wide range of measurements. We will try to put those moorings back in the water the same year after collecting the data and changing the batteries, and leave them there until 2026, when we will have another cruise to recover them. And so then we'll already have started to establish a reasonably long time series in this area. Yeah, this is what I wanted to tell you today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the report.